Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our monthly series where we aim to highlight rigorous research on the scientific study of international migrations. We're so glad you could join us today for the final seminar of the academic year. My name is Jens Heimerle. I'm a faculty director here at the Immigration Policy Lab, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. So quickly before we begin, housekeeping. So as usual, the session is being recorded. Recording of the presentation will be available on the IPL website and the YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located on the bottom of your screen. You can just pop in a question. And during the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for our presenter to answer. And due to our limited time, we might not get to all of the questions, but we'll try. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll send a link to a Google form in the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and suggest speakers for future seminars. And the link can also be found on the IPL website. And now, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Giovanni Peri. He's the Brian Cameron Distinguished Professor in International Economics at the University of California, Davis, and a research associate at the NVER in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His research, as many of you will know, focuses on the impact of international migrations on labor markets and productivity in receiving countries, on the determinants of international migrations, and on the evaluations of policies for the integration of migrants and refugees worldwide. He's published widely in a variety of areas, made some central contributions, and we're really thrilled to have him. So Giovanni, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jens. Thank you for having me here. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started with today's seminar. Okay, you guys see the screen?
Yeah, all good. We're good to go.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you for having me here. And today I will talk about this topic on how much foreign student, in particular master student, contribute to U.S. entrepreneurship. And this is a joint work with Michelle Bain at Luxembourg and Morgan Rowe at Aix-Marseille. So the topic of today is at the intersection of two areas which are crucial for the U.S. productivity growth. They have been very important. The U.S. is one of the most entrepreneurial countries in the world. A lot of ranking put him at the top of country in terms of firm creation per person, in terms of entrepreneurship. And a lot of these companies are in startup companies. I will define in a second what I mean for startup companies, are created by people who study and get a graduate degree. 60% of them are created by people with a graduate degree in the US. And at the same time, the US is a world leader in tertiary education and especially in graduate education. So if you look at the ranking in the world of US master and PhD, they are always at the very top, and they attract a lot of high quality students from all over the world. It is also well known that foreign born in the US tend to be more entrepreneurial than native. There are a lot of studies that look in general how likely are foreigners to create firms in the US, and both at the top for very high tech and high productivity company and at the bottom from small mom and pop shop, they have a very high entrepreneurship rate. So today I will talk about the role of students, for master student, in creating a company and what type of company I have in mind. So a startup is a company that bring new ideas or new concept to the market, and it is fast growth and it is impactful. So here are some examples of company that many of you know: the Chobani yogurt company, the Zumba franchise, which is one of the most successful exercise franchise in the US, Coursera, which is one of the most successful online learning platform. All of these have been created by the people who are in my data set, who have come to the United States to do a master, and either they have combined themselves with an American to create these companies, or they have created them by themselves. So the question of today is, does an increase in the share of foreign-born students in a master program have an impact, a positive causal impact on the startup rates, so the amount of startup created by this group of master graduating students within their first 5 years after graduation? You need to put an interval of time after graduation to study them consistently over time. And the second question is, does this effect, if we find one, and we will, come through the fact that the foreigners themselves are more entrepreneurial, or is there a spillover on American students who have gone to the master in the same cohort and school and program with this foreigner, so that they become more or less entrepreneurial? Of course, the spillover could be positive or negative, depending if they are inspired or if they are crowded out. And then, if such a spillover exists, what are the channels of this spillover? We'll try to decompose a little bit this spillover. So this is the basic analysis. And in order to do this, I anticipate a few things that we'll do before going in detail a little bit more, is we will need to bring together two databases. One is this Crunchbase data set, which is the most complete data set on US startups. It is a self-crowdsourced, so this company, because they want to do business to business, have been registering themselves in this Crunchbase, and it starts the Crunchbase in the early 2000s and is very complete in the mid 2000 on, a little bit less complete before. We're going to choose these 20 years between 99 and up to COVID, and then we're going to merge this Crunchbase that identify. So this is the key thing of this database, is that very few data set in the US identify the founder of a company. Like census data, administrative data don't really have the founder that needs to be identified as an early employee, depending. But this does have it. And so we merge this specific founder with a data set that covers all the master program in the US and many other information, which is the International Public Education Dataset, that allow us to measure the master program, people who went to the master program in the US. And what we will use, so the unit of observation will be the university cohort master program variation across different master program years and university to assess this causal effect. Of course, the correlation between how many foreign students are in a cohort master university and how many become entrepreneur can be subject to a lot of endogeneity and omitted variables. So we have two instrumental variable strategy that we use. One is we use the kind of unexpected variation of tuitions, in particular of tuition of out-of-state tuition across these programs as a changing cost for foreign students to attend the master. And another is a more traditional shift share country network-based program, but we will argue that this shift share works well because the origin of the foreign student from the 90s and in the post-2000 changed quite a bit. So who was coming as a graduate student before 9/11, that was a big revolution in the way in which foreign students were admitted, was different from after. And so there are the conditions for the shift share to work. And we estimated the impact of foreign born and on US born. So the results are that that we will find is that for each increase in 10 percentage points of foreign born in a cohort, and this 10 percentage point of foreign born means 60 more foreign students, this will generate about 0.6 extra startups. So for each 100 students, foreign student, one more startup in the master cohort. And this in aggregate means about 4,000 additional startups. And to give you an idea, this startup, our database is biased, but we will towards startup of high quality that raise quite a lot of capital, that survive for a long time, and that generate innovation. We will give you a little bit more. It's not just they generate startup. They generate startup that over several performance metrics do quite well. And this is a relatively large number. Where we will not have very good data is how many jobs they create. But again, on average, one of this company go to create few hundreds of jobs in the long run because they are strong. So the employment effect can be important. Out of this effect of this extra startup, between 1/3 and 2/3 of the effect is actually come from Americans who are in the same cohort of these foreigner. And this is an interesting effect because, as I will argue, many of these foreign students will not even stay in the United States after graduation. Only about 30% of them will stay. But this spillover effect on Americans is very persistent, on the other hand, and expands the effect. And I will discuss how this effect comes from co-founding between American and foreigners of this new startup, and from an increase of differentiation. They create companies that, in a way that we will define, are different from the other companies that are created by other Americans. Okay, I'm going to skip the literature review and I'm going to jump into the data. So how do we do this? So I told you that we're going to use this international education data. And so what we do is we measure the number of graduates in each university by degree, and we can separate who are the international and the native students in each year over the 2014. We stop in 2014 in the graduation because we want to get all the company created within 5 years of graduation. And then from this database, we also have what is the tuition fee which is charged to master student in each degree and university year, in state and out of state, separating the out of state. The foreigner students are going to be subject to the out of state tuition. And we will use this in a way that I will be clear in a second as one of our margin of variation to generate exogenous variation. And then Crunchbase, which is this data set that we, again, allow us to see for each company that bring innovation to market, and in this data set, we can, because of the database, identify the founder and identify the higher degree of the founder. And if it's a master student from a US university between this period, this will be the group of startups that we consider. And we match these startup founders with the cohort that they come from. And this, in total, we cover this 4 million master graduate students over 18 years. And of them, of the student, we can match them up with all the information that we need for about half of the startup creator. So we have a part in of the paper in which we show that this part that we match is very representative of the total. For the compressed time today, I'm not going to show you the detail, but I'm happy to discuss that more. There are some pros and cons of using, and I'm happy to discuss more in the question-based part of using this. I would say that the biggest pro is that this is a sample of startup that probably oversample a little bit the successful startup in the US, because you need to register and survive for a little while, and identifies the founder by names, which is hard to do, and allows us to match through the degree. One thing that we don't know about the founders of the companies themselves is if they're really foreign born or not. So we know how many foreigners there are in the master class from the data on the iPads, but then out of the startup founders, we have their first and last name. And so I will show you how we infer with some algorithm and some checks from their first and last name if they are US or foreign born, because that's crucial to separate the spillover effect versus the direct effect. So you don't need to separate them to look at the total effect of foreign student in the master class, but you need that to separate, and we will discuss that. Couple of examples from the sample, just to look at what are the top public and private universities in generating startups in this period, and what is the startup rate. On average, university have a 5 per 10,000 student startup rate, so these are all well above. No surprise, the good public, Berkeley, Los Angeles, UCs, Texas, Michigan are at the top. Stanford is a massive outlier. They create a way more startup than anybody else, both in aggregate and in per capita terms. We know that, and of course, one of the reasons is the type of, the location of Stanford, the type of specialization of the master. So we will need to control for a bunch of those things. And here, let me give you an idea of how we identify the foreign-born and the US-born from our Crunchbase, and how we measure the foreign-born in the cohort. In the cohort of master student, we just consider as foreign the people who have an F or a J visa in that university cohort. And so these are people who came to the US to study, and they are probably not even all the foreign-born in the class. If somebody came as a kid, as a permanent resident status is not, are people who came to that cohort to get a degree on a visa. And then to separate US and non-US, we use as a first round this four bears algorithm that from first and last name, based on the distribution of first and last name in the world, identify who are the people born in the US and assign a weight, a probability of being born in the US versus being born elsewhere. And just want to emphasize that using both first and last name is relevant in order to identify the probability. But clearly, this algorithm, I'm going to show you in a second, could underestimate the American-born, because a lot of second-generation immigrants will have names combination that sound foreigner but really are born in the US. So in order to assess how big is this, and maybe, so this paper is under revision now, we did this on a subsample of 1,500 entrepreneurs out of the 40,000 that we use, but maybe we'll need to do it for all in order to really kill the this issue in terms of spillover. So what we did is, for this group, we did manually with a lot of arrays, a very detailed search online, on web page, video, Facebook, social media, in order to try to get really to where these people were born, not just where their name sounded like. And this is the 2x2 matrix that compare this revealed being foreign born observed through this very hard search with this algorithm predicted. There are about 75% of them in the main diagonal, so correctly identified. But the biggest error, which is about 20% of the total here, is that we identify as foreigner people who are actually US born because they're second generation. So if anything, this we use this error then to bound our estimate of the spillover. But as you already can have an intuition, this error will make it sound, it will generate a lower bound of our spillover, because we will think that some of the people who actually are American are foreign born, and we will attribute a direct effect to some of this group. So as you will see, this correction will generate actually spillover. That's why spillover go from 1/3 to 2/3, because this correction generates actually a little bit an increase in the estimate of potential spillover from that. Okay. The distribution of this master student by major is, there are some master of startup creator by major. Of course, business management, finance, and all the business type of major are a very large chunk. In total, are about 20% of the total. But computer engineering are together another very, very large group. Health and physical sciences are important, and then social science, communication going down. But there is quite some variation across different fields. And then this is relevant for us. Who are the startup students from which country do they come from? And obviously India does a lot of the work. A lot of this period is the period of the huge boom of Indian and Chinese students in the US in the post-2003 world. But if you add all the European, Germany, Russia, Italy, France, they are as large, if not larger than this. So there is certainly some variation coming from the other. But as I will indicate, some of our identification will really be based on the variation of Indian and Chinese that arrive in large number in this period. An interesting point, an interesting quantity to look at, or statistics, is for the period that we consider, what is the entrepreneurship rate of Americans in gray and foreigners in black. And this says that the probability of creating a company out of 10,000 graduates is about 3 to 4 times larger for a foreigner. But notice this, the solid line are companies created in the US. The dashed line are company created anywhere in the world, because Crunchbase has a company created anywhere. And you see that the foreigners, a lot of the company that they create are elsewhere in the world, because many of them, in fact, almost 60% of them go back to their countries, while the US only create in US their company. And overall, this foreign student seems to have a 4 to 5 times larger entrepreneurship rate directly. So one could even, and I will give you some idea, naively just multiply this entrepreneurship rate of foreigner and say, oh, they contribute that many. But as I will show you, because the spillover are so large, you will underestimate by often 60% how much firm they create. So the basic identification and the basic equation that we'll estimate is very simple. On the left-hand side, there is a measure of the number of startups which are created by a university master cohort in year T. And then we control for university master cohort time effect. And then this is some measure will be the share of foreign born, or in some specification in which we get the elasticity, the total number of foreign born. I will tell you also how, in a sense, we will say that increasing the foreign born but keeping constant the total number of students in a cohort. That's how to interpret the result. That's why we use the share and we instrument. And then we control for some characteristics of the university, which are their ranking, their funding, and a few other controls. And of course, running this regression in OLS as one particular, as many endogeneity issue, but one that we point out that, as you will see, bias a lot the OLS down is this idea that very often important factor that determine where students locate in the US are the local economy, how the local economy is doing, and how the local living costs are. And interestingly, this bias is kind of the opposite of the one that you will have if you were going in the labor market in the US. If you go to the labor market, you want to go in places that are growing and in places that pay higher wages. But if you just go to study, you want to go in places which pay a little bit lower wages, that have lower prices, in particular lower housing prices. And this correlation will generate this inverse relation between enrolling in master and probability of entrepreneurship at a local level and a cohort level that, as you will see, generate a bias.
Giovanni, three quick clarifying questions.
Please.
So one is, does the data include MBA students?
It does.
Okay, and the second one is what's the difference in terms of the entrepreneurship between master students and PhD students? Like, why not do this for PhD students?
That's a good point. So the PhD students, so out of 80% of the companies created by a graduate student are created by master student and 20 by PhD. The issue is a little bit this cleaner way in which we construct the instrument. This master all last 2 years. And so we want to use the tuition when the people arrive to predict what happens 2 years later. The PhD are kind of 5-6 years. And so it's a little bit harder for us to identify a shifter of the class, of the size of the PhD of class of entry. So for now, we keep the master. One could do the PhD students, certainly, in sort of an extension. Here we focus a little bit for cleanliness of identification and because they are the majority.
Okay, great. And then last question, is the reason why the biotech firms are so low because those are the PhD, the ones that need a PhD to found them?
In biotech, you found this low? Which biotech, you mean health studies plus, what is biological and biomedical? Yeah. I think that a lot of, so this is maybe, but also maybe that a lot of the biotech are really founded by people who have engineering, maybe, and physical science. And maybe you need a higher degree. I think the major reason is that there are not as many masters in bio and biomedical, and maybe there is a little bit of a bias towards PhD here. Yes, so it could be, yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the two IV that we construct. So the first is this, we use the difference in out-of-state and in-state tuition at master year university level, and we regress it on quality proxy of the university, which is the ranking of the university, the group that the university belongs to, the funding of the university in terms of state appropriation, and the lagged value of how many international graduates the university admitted. This type of strategy can only be applied to public university because, as you know, only public university has this differentiation. And we first do this regression to clean this difference from kind of systematic variation of tuition. And then we use the residual of this regression lagged to period at t-2 as predicting how many foreign students, the share of foreign students that graduate in T from public university. So this difference is clearly a cost difference between foreigner and native. There are some out-of-state native students, but first of all, they are a much smaller share of the total. So if on average you have 60% of national student, of the remaining 40%, 30-35 are international and a small group of out-of-state. And the second is that, more importantly, they are much less sensitive in our test to this tuition. And the idea is that foreign students who come to the US have decided, but then they have a choice across universities, and they're probably more internally mobile when they decide than a native student who have an own bias, and they tend to go to the university in their own state, and so the elasticity of response to this is much larger for foreigners, and that's what makes this a good instrument for foreigners. There could be a confounder, and so I tell you how we test that this instrument changes the share of foreign born, but doesn't change the quality of the national student. And then the other instrument that we use is a more standard shift share, in which we look at how many students in 1999 were in each university from origin O, where in each university university master program U, and we use this share to allocate the post-2003 total flow of immigrant, of foreign students. These data are from the F1 visa which are given, and then we aggregate all the origin to generate a share of foreign student in that cohort, that master program, that university. One important thing to notice is that we use one thing that changed a lot, and that's why Chinese and Indian students, as I will just give you an idea, are not very correlated, their share with what was happening before 99, is that after 9/11 and the introduction of this electronic system to admit foreign students, there was a big boom of students in 2003, 2015, really driven by these new kids on the block, which were the Indians and the Chinese, that before had been some of the graduate students, but then they became larger. So the shift share works well when there is a change in the origins, because often the share pre-99 are not very correlated with the total share of students before, with the total growth of the university before, and that's what we show when we use this as validity. Now here I have a lot of
question,
question.
Giovanni, about the previous instrument, whether you could give us some intuition for what this the non-predicted gap intuition, like what does that capture? Like, who are the universities that are high? Are these universities that are overcharging for what they offer, or how should we think about that?
Very often, some of this increase in out-of-state tuition come from, or decrease come from, so the University of California had a couple of these increases that they have come from a political sentiment that you needed to protect UC for Californians, and so you needed to make it a bit harder for foreigner to come in. So controlling for these characteristics, these are often a little bit of either harshening or softening of the sentiment in the aggregate sense of who should come to the public university. Very often are in kind of response to some funding changes, because state appropriation drop, you use that margin in order to increase the tuition. Other time are because new president come in and they want to generate generate some extra resources or generate some extra sign. The reason why we take the difference is that often in-state tuition are more regulated, because they affect the big bulk of them, and so the margin of the university is a little bit on this, but there are many different reasons. So we try to, in one check, we try to identify only the big changes in tuition. In fact, this is one of the, let me just show you, one of the tests is that if we just isolate the big change on tuition residual, and you look at the pre-trend that university had on some foreign student and so on, this seems to be relatively random, relatively uncorrelated with these relatively big changes. So there is a set of variety. We don't just focus on one type of increase. We use these residual changes, arguing that they are more idiosyncratic than just the variation of tuition, and particularly of variation of in-state tuition.
Thank you.
So the test here, and I'm looking because I have 15 minutes, I want to go to the results. The tests are, first of all, the power of IV. Let me just, of course, we do the Goldsmith-Pinkham type of test for the, let me just show you very quickly, maybe, oops, one second, what did I do? Yeah, sometimes I do this. Okay. No, sorry. So this test here, I don't know why I have some problem here in clicking on this. Why? I'm going to tell you quickly. I want to go to the result and the channels. This Goldsmith-Pinkham show that the Chinese and the Indian have by far the biggest Rothenberg weight, and then we check what the estimates are just using these two groups, and they are very similar to the estimate using the shift share. And then two important one are these instruments correlated with the native enrollment, and are they correlated with the quality of native enrollment? Those two could be very important, and what we can do here is to show that the IV are correlated with the foreign, but not the native enrollment, and they are not correlated with the only measure that we have of native specific quality, which is the graduation rate of natives. So they seem to move the number of foreigners without affecting the quantity and quality of American students. And so this increase in the share comes from an increase in the foreign born without changing too much the number of American students. Okay, so the main results, which I show you here, this is the main effect. So as you notice, the OLS downward bias is significant. The IV effect, the IV estimate, let me focus on this, says that for each 10% increase in foreign born, you have a 0.6%, so you multiply this by 10, 0.6% increase in the number, sorry, 0.6 increase in the number of companies with roughly both instruments you have between 5 and 6. If you focus on companies that survived 3 years or more, these are the higher quality. 3 years or more, about 60% of startup die in the first 3 years. Almost all of them, the whole effect is preserved. If you focus on companies that raise within 3 years above the median of capital raise, which is about 25 million, almost all of them are of this higher quality. And if you focus on this very selected group, which are companies that in the first 3 years do at least one patent application, which is only 3% of the total, almost 1.1 out of this 0.6 effect come with a company that innovates, which is much larger than the average, which is only 2% of new startup generated that. And also a large, more than half of the company are in the same metro area. Local means in the same metro area as the school is. So a lot of the effect is at the local level. And as you notice, the estimate with the two IV are relatively consistent. These are the tuition and these are the shift share. I will focus on the tuition IV estimate, which seems to be a little bit stronger and a little bit more precise. So overall, 10 percentage point or more foreigners, 10 percentage point extra share of foreigner generates this increase. And then we also do a bunch of other robustness tests of trend, school-specific trend, university by 5-year period fixed effect, and some interesting heterogeneity, which shows that these effects are not only in the top university, are stronger in STEM, and they are stronger in larger city, but they are pretty prevalent. Instead, let me talk about the spillover effect and the channel in the time that I have left. So the spillover effect, to estimate the spillover effect, what we do is we run the same regression and we use the same instrument, but on the left-hand side, instead of the total number of startup, we put the startup which, according to our algorithm, have been created by a US founder. And here you can do it in two ways. Either you establish a threshold above which our algorithm, we consider them US born, or we just multiply by the probability, which seems to be more for, given that the analysis at the cohort level, each individual is multiplied by the probability of being US or non-US born, and those are the results that I am going to show. And the tuition, and we use the tuition and the shift share ID. And here, if we look at what is a spillover, remember the main coefficient was a 0.06. Out of the 0.06, if you use this, if you only focus on the company which have been created by US born, you have that 0.4 of them, 1/3 of them, and here the difference between the two estimates is a little bit bigger. So between 1/3 and 2/3 of them are created by Americans. And also high quality, the same pattern of surviving, high quality in terms of above the median funding, and high quality in terms of patenting. And the interesting thing is that once you use that measurement error that we derived from identifying in the subsample who is really US born, and you use essentially this a bootstrapping method in which every time you draw one foreign born, then you reassess the probability of being foreign born or US born, correcting for the measurement error. This is the distribution of spillover estimates that you will generate by using them measurement error with the shift share IV and with the tuition IV. And two things are clear. First of all, in both distribution, you reject the zero spillover very strongly at any confidence level. And second, most of the mass of the distribution is between an effect that goes between 0.25 and 0.45, which is, again, between 1/3 and 2/3 of the total effect is coming from the spillover. So is in the spillover. So this distribution we realize is a little large, and we could make it a little bit more precise by probably identifying all of these people as most likely foreign born, and most likely by just doing the hard check on all of them, and probably we will go there. So now let me talk a little bit about what we talk about channels. So channels, maybe you can think of this as, again, decomposing that effect of extra company into two directions. The first is in this universe of startup that we have, 15% are co-founded, but many more of the one extra that are generated by foreign born are co-founded. And the idea here is that one, maybe immigrant and foreigner and native have idea that put together generate more innovation. This is the complementarity in idea. And we're going to see how much of the effect comes from co-founded company. But also, there are some legal limits for foreigners to be really founder of companies. By the way, I'm sure some people will ask me later, what kind of visa do these students have in the period that they found? Mostly they have H-1B visa and OPT extensions. And while they are founding, they need to be doing something else. So some of them cannot be founder, but they can be in the original team that creates the company as a financial officer, administrative officer, information technology officer. And given that we have this information from Crunchbase, we're also going to look at whether on top of co-founding in terms of creator, Americans become more likely to have which have been in classes with large foreigner, become more likely to have in the initial team more foreigners. And so again, we run a regression in which on the left-hand side, same structure, the left-hand side now there are co-founded companies rather than all company. And then this is the first 4 columns. And then the last 2 is company that have foreign collaborators created by American but with foreign collaborators, which means, collaborator means this chief officer from other countries. And so as you see here, really a very large part of this extra company, in particular with the estimate of tuition, but also with the IV, are co-founded. And the interesting part is that 1/3 of them is co-founded by people who had who were exposed to foreign born and co-found with foreign born in the same university, so with their classmates. But another 1/3 is created by Americans who co-found with foreign born who were not necessarily in their class group. So Americans become more likely to create and co-found with foreigners on top of just their classmates. The results are weaker here. And then Americans become also more likely, so 1/3 of this company maybe not only is co-founded or may or may not be co-founded, but has one third of them has one foreigner in the initial team of financial officers, administrative officer, and IT officer. So interesting, this seemed to be one important channel. And then the other channel that we are looking at a little bit is this idea. And here, I think, is where the paper probably will expand more, because now this text analysis can be sophisticated. So the idea is the following. Can we characterize, with the information that we have in Crunchbase, companies' differentiation in some sense? So each one of these company needs to choose a set of from 1 to 10 keywords out of a set of options. And remember, I put Chobani, I put Zumba in there. So some of the words which are chosen are this. So what we do is we characterize each company by these 717 dimensional vectors of what word were chosen. And then we calculate a vector distance between these companies. And we define a startup as differentiated relative to the other if the distance of this startup to the average vector of the US founded company in a year is above the median. So companies who have a vector of words that define them, which are farther than one standard deviation away from the median American company, we call them as differentiated from the US space. And then, given that we also have the company which are created in the world, in the international space, we can create an indicator that is proximity to international content. We calculate the average vector of an international company, and we look at whether the startup generated in the US is closer to the average international company at a distance which is below the median of an American company to the international ones. So are these companies created a little bit more different from Americans, a little bit more similar in content to the foreign one? And again, here are the results splitting. The first two are distance from the average. How many of the 0.6 created have a distance which is larger than the one standard deviation? And so again, about 2/3 of this new company created are more different than one standard deviation from the average American company. And again, 2/3 of them are closer to the average of a foreign company than the average American. And this is pretty consistent between the two. And so this, we take it at least as initial evidence, and we are already aware that we can do much better in this space of ideas, but we take it as initial evidence that the American companies which have been created by this foreign-born, by people who studied with this foreign-born, are a little bit different from the rest. Okay, so, well, I realized that here I was so worried to be late that I am a couple of minutes early, but hopefully that's okay. So the idea here is that this paper generates, uses new data, merging these two data sets, and an identification strategy which is new, and try to use the standard and innovate to identify the answer to this question: how important are foreign-born students in master program to create a startup? Every 100 extra master student, we have one more startup. And again, in aggregate, this is 4,000 startup per year. And again, in a back of the envelope calculation that we have in the paper, this correspond to 200,000 jobs within the first 3 years that this company are created. Rather than reading this, which is the same, let me say one thing. How is this relevant? This is in 2025. The prediction of 2025 is that there has been a decline in foreign student, undergraduate and master in the US by 33%. So if we had normally 300,000 master student coming in 2025, and the prediction for 26 are similar, we only have 200,000 as a consequence of, the tougher measure, the H-1B, more restrictive policy that affect if students want to come or not. And this in the medium run can be a big can have a big impact on this startup creation in the US. And so understanding what could be the consequences on innovation, but also on job creation and on firm creation of this potentially big change and big decline in foreign students that we seem to be experiencing in the last year can be an important part of the story of the potentially persistent consequences of some of these measures that we're going through. So I'm going to stop it here so that we have a little time if there are some questions, and I'm happy to go back to show some more other things if people are interested. So for the moment, I'll give it back to Jens.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Giovanni, for the fascinating talk. So there's a couple of questions. I'll just take them in order here. So how does your data set handle foreign students who transfer across state? Does this mobility affect how they are classified as in-state or out-of-state, and could it influence the results you obtain?
Foreign students cannot classify for the in-state tuition unless they have been resident for a while. So I guess you have in mind the student who come as undergraduate and stay long enough. But in order to be considered an in-state student, you need to be an American citizen and a residency of the state. And so unless these people also got the American citizenship, that for some happen, but it's quite unlikely, then you're classified as a foreign student. So mobility across a state. So I think the answer is that the F and the J are certainly students who come from abroad. Students who stay in a state and move from another are very unlikely. They are very unlikely to be classified as in-state. And the transfer students are not so many within a master program. So I would say that if you look at the F visa, F1 visa, and then in another paper we connect them with the OPT visa, a large percentage complete the master where they actually started it. So this moving across state is not as common for foreigners.
Great, thank you. And there was a question about the identification, a couple of questions about the identification, but one is, so like you said that the foreign-born numbers increased, but the natives basically didn't change very much. So does that imply that the total class size increased, but the specification also, you said that you kept the size the same? So what's going on there? Is it just that like more students creates more startups, or is the size held fixed?
There in the specification here, the aggregate size of the start. Let me actually show that if I'm able that robustness check. Just a second, and then we can. Okay, so I don't know why. Okay, here we go. Why it doesn't become? I don't know why it doesn't become a little. Well, I go. Let me go directly. So the effect that here is the effect of our instrument. When you change the tuition, or when you change the shift share in aggregate, so there is for the increase in tuition, there is a significant decline in the number of foreign graduates, not a significant change in the number of US students. So overall, the aggregate size decreases, but not significantly, because these are 10% of the total. So the share changes, the size changes a little bit, and the same when you use the shift share. The effect on 90% of the student is that. So we have specification in which we control for the size of the cohort, but the size of the cohort is not very correlated with how many students you have. What it really changes is the number of foreign students and the share, because they are the 10% of the total. These affect much more the share than the total effect. But so the answer is the estimate I showed you, you should think of this as changing the number of foreign students and controlling for the size of the cohort, and so attributing this effect to a change in the share of foreign students in the group.
Okay, thank you. And then here's a question that I had. I'll just jump the queue here a little bit. So one worry I would have about this IV is that if I think about the administrator, having more data than you have about the expected sort of demand that's coming from the master students, right? So if they see the application pipeline, which you don't see, and so they can make a good estimate about what's going to be the demand, and they're going to set the out of state tuition price depending on that demand. So if they're, the increase in the tuition could basically proxy for unobserved increase in the demand. If there's a China boom and that university is favored by Chinese applicants because they hired fancy faculty, or there's a famous startup that comes from that university and suddenly basically that university is higher on the list of
Hmm.
applicants. It could be
Hmm.
basically that this increase in the tuition that you can't explain with your model is essentially an unobserved quality increase that could also be correlated with future startup growth. Does that make sense?
Quality of the foreign student?
Yeah, I mean, just like the quality of the environment that they
Ah,
provide, which
I
basically
see.
is priced in by the administrators because they can make a better estimate of the
Yeah.
demand, right?
So two pieces to the answer to your question. Number one, you're right that a cleaner identification will be identifying the application, the number of applicants, and then how many people are admitted and end up doing the master. This is very hard to do at a disaggregate scale. There is not such a systematic way. One can do it, I guess, on some university and focusing a little bit. So I agree with you that one will want to potentially control for number of applicants when they do this. One thing, though, of the story that you say, which seems to be not quite what is happening, is that there is this significant effect. So if what drives the change in tuition is a change in demand, so there should have been a positive correlation between tuition and the number of students. Why increasing the tuition significantly decreases the number of foreign students that come in once you control for the other. So it seems to be that it's not a change in demand, but is moving along the demand and generating a decrease in the inflow of students. This fact that this instrument is powerful, affect the number of foreign students, doesn't seem to affect very much the quality of American students. Here, the other thing that we try to do is that if we look at how it's correlated with the past share of international students, this instrument is really not significantly correlated to that. And again, so if you think that there are some omitted trend that a school is becoming better at attracting some students and so can get some rents, so that in the past the increase of foreign students predicts the increase in rents, increase in out-of-state tuition, this doesn't seem to be really much going on in the data. So I cannot dispel your story. We think about it and we try to tackle it with some tests and some checks in our paper, but I agree with you. Maybe that's a room. There is room for more.
Yeah, some sort of placebo checks. Okay, great. Another question. So a possible alternative to expanding ideas would be that foreign students increase competition, so everyone works harder, becomes more proficient, and this possibly spills over into entrepreneurship. If I understood correctly, much of the effect goes through the STEM fields, which are rather exact in nature. It would be nice if there were some within university quality measure or a standardized test would be ideal that can be compared between cohorts.
Good point. So here, quality. So we do have one regression in which we control for the standardized test of student entering the university. However, this measure is not available for master student. You can only do it in aggregate. So it's a very imprecise measure. In particular, is a lot of based on undergraduate. So we don't observe the increase in the share of foreign master affecting the quality of the undergraduate that the university accepts. So the university becoming more selective or better at identifying them. As I said before, the only quality of American students that we have and we can control for is the graduation rate. And so here is the correlation of our instrument with the graduation rate of Americans, master student. That's the only master specific. And even here we don't find a strong correlation. So I am sympathetic to the idea that part of the spillover can come from looking at a group of students who is creative, works hard, and so American seems to mirror some of that. For the measure that we could find that didn't seem to translate in measurable quality while they are in school, at least, of some of these students, but clearly there seemed to be a much bigger tendency to create network with foreigner and expand. So again, in terms of relative explanation, we went with the second one where we found more evidence. And this of the quality of that we try to tackle of American students didn't seem, at least for the available measure, didn't seem to be as strong.
Great. Another question was about the Crunchbase database, the
Hmm.
coverage. So
Hmm.
it's the question is asking like, is it possible that the coverage basically of the database over time improved faster in more entrepreneurial sort of areas, which could lead sort of like a time varying confound that your fixed effects that are by year and unit don't pick up.
So let me think a second. So this Crunchbase dataset was created in 2004, but in the sense that firm started registering with 2004, but firm, this is the year of creation of the firm. So clearly there has been some backfilling. So it's true that Crunchbase is better in the post 2006 period. And we have a version of the paper in which we look if the results are robust to the post 2006 analysis, and they are. Our variation is school by program by year. And so not only we have year fixed effect and school by period fixed effect, we have also school specific trends. So we actually reason and we convince ourselves that a lot of some of these maybe aggregate increased coverage that happens over time, unless it's very differential within a school across fields, should have not affected our estimates. And again, you probably should look at the most controlled estimate, which are school by 5 year by program fixed effect, which are somewhere here. I don't know if I can click on them. Let me see. And that seemed to have, let me see if I have a report. We certainly did it. Let me see if I can just easily click in one. Sorry, it was here. Okay. Oh my God, sorry. Okay, that this is the, I know that. Okay, I don't know. Okay, you know why my cursor does not become the little finger? Do you know why? What I'm doing
We
wrong?
gotta
Yes,
ask Samantha.
why it doesn't become the little finger when I go on it, and so I cannot click on this. Yeah. So anyway, let me see if I can find it. Control. Yeah, here it is. So this is actually the estimate in which university period program and university specific trends. So if anything, this effect seems a little bit larger than they were before with both of them. And so I don't know that change is biasing down the results, but certainly we need to put something to account for this change in coverage over time of Crunchbase.
Great. So last question. So your estimates show that only 20% of the foreign master students end up staying. So the founders essentially that stay, maybe they're like, the best of the best. So is there a possibility that there's some sort of selection coming from that affect the results, or more, or another way to think about that is like, could that, if you have a shift in the cost, if that shifts it towards
Mm.
graduates, students from poorer backgrounds, which might have less of an ability to actually stay, would
Mhm.
you get less of that effect?
Okay, that's a good point. So let me actually address so it's very important, and I didn't spend very much time to understand what are the marginal students that our instrument affects, because the identification comes from those. And if you think about is a tuition instrument, clearly the marginal complier of this instrument are students who would have not come if the tuition was larger, and instead they come. So are likely smart students, but in general with not as a wealthy background, maybe. And so on one end, I think that their margin tells us that the university are selecting along the right dimension, because admitting a few more of those marginal by decreasing the cost has the effect that we observe, and so has this positive and significant effect. The other instrument act on the margin of who responds to network, which is a little bit harder for me to interpret. So number one is not the sort of the marginal student is probably relatively high quality. Number two, one thing that I didn't do it, and we're doing this a little bit more, the direct effect of students, which is that we estimate, which is, as I said, from 1/3 to 2/3 of the effect is a direct effect of the student coming, is not very different from the average effect. If you just take the average entrepreneurship of foreign born, and you multiply it by how many they are in the class, you will get an extra number of company, which is 0.3, half of the effect. So the average entrepreneurship is not very different from the marginal entrepreneurship. And so this distribution of entrepreneurship must not be decaying very fast between the average and the marginal, because the two effects are relatively similar of foreign born. Of course, when you make it more challenging for foreigner to come in, you're only selecting the high quality. But if on average, if the quality of who you're bringing in is higher than the average quality of the people in the country, you're still losing high quality people relative to the average who are not coming. So very long thing. My short answer is, number one, who stay are probably the people at the top. Number two, some of this effect of spillover, though, come from people who are not at the top, who are relatively marginal in here, and they are still quite entrepreneurial. Number three, I think that making it harder for a group to come may reduce and increase the quality, but by reducing the number of people who come, who on average are higher quality than the natives, still is going to hurt overall both the spillover and the direct effect.
Perfect. So thanks a lot for all of the questions, and thank you very much, Giovanni, for a fascinating presentation to close out our inaugural season. And thanks for all who have joined us throughout the academic year. This is the first year we've been doing the Science of International Migration seminar, and we're grateful for all the speakers, collaborators, and audience for helping us build such a thoughtful and engaging community around migration research. As we wrap up this final year, the final webinar of the year, we invite you to stay connected with us and be the first to hear about next year's seminar lineup, news and events and updates. The link to sign up for newsletters in the chat. So thanks again, Giovanni, for doing this, and we look forward to seeing you next season.
Thank you very much.
Have a good summer. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, gents.